We want to talk a little bit about the lines, the differences that separate Arabs from Turks and Iranians.
These are three different languages. And they're not only three different languages, but they belong to three different groups. They are totally unrelated languages.
Right.
Arabic is a Semitic language related to Hebrew. Turkish is a Turco-Tatar language related to Tatar and Mongol, and more distantly to Hungarian and Finnish. And Persian is an Indo-European language related to the languages of India and more distantly to the languages of Europe. I mean, in Persian, father is Pedar, and mother is Madar, and brother is Biradar. That tells you to which language family it belongs. Kinship terms are basic.
So much for the claims of pan-Islam.
Yeah.
I mean,
you have these three languages, which, as I say, are not only different, but unrelated, except, of course, for the large vocabulary of Arabic loanwords
right.
in both, and a lot of Persian loanwords in Turkish.
That's a very important distinction.
Yes.
Fundamental, I think.
Yeah.
Again, at the risk of using the pronoun I and overusing it, I know something about these differences because I come from a mixed Arab and Persian ancestry. For those uninitiated, we know that my last name means the Persian. And my mother came from very, very long Arabic tradition. Her ancestors had been in Greater Syria and Lebanon for a very, very long time. But my great-grandfather on my paternal side had come from Iran in the 1850s. And my late and beloved mother always had a word or two about these Persians who came to her part of Lebanon. From afar, maybe to the uninitiated, these people have striking similarities, but we know they don't. We know they don't. We know that the Persians are completely sui generis in many ways, and we know that the Arabs are very different. We know the Turks are very different, and I know that one way of thinking about this, I learned from you, that it depends on whether you define Turkey as a European country or a Muslim country. It depends on where do you enter Turkey. And so what about these lines and differences?
Yes, well, most people from the Western world who go to Turkey go from the West, from Europe or America, and arrive in Istanbul. I first set foot in Turkey from the south. I had spent some time in Syria, and before that in Egypt. And my first experience of Turkey was in Ankara and other places around there, and later in Istanbul. And I think I may say, you're quite right, Fouad, that this has really shaped my perception of the country ever since, having come from the south and the past instead of from the west and the present.
Yes.
But there is another point which I think is important, the difference between the Turks and the Persians on the one hand and the Arabs on the other. It was the Arabs, of course, who created the great Islamic state and the great Islamic civilization from the 7th century onwards. But then, as we know, the Arabs lost control. They lost control of the civilization of the state which they themselves had created. They became a subordinate element. And the Middle East was ruled or contested by non-Arabs, mainly Turks, and then from the 16th, 17th century onwards, Persians as well. Now, Turkey and Iran, Turkey and Persia, whichever you like to call it, are real countries in the European sense of that word. Let me explain what I mean. In Europe, there's a country which is called Denmark, inhabited by people called Danes who speak a language called Danish. There's a country called Spain, inhabited by Spaniards who speak a language called Spanish, and so on and so on. And their loyalty to their country is known as patriotism. That pattern does not apply anywhere in the Arab world, with the possible exception of Saudi Arabia, a very problematic exception. It does apply very clearly in Iran, and in a different way in Turkey. Iran is a country of great diversity of population. If you look around it, there are all sorts of ethnic minorities. There are Turks of various types. There are Arabs. There are Baluchis. There are Kurds. But they have a clearly defined common sense of identity. The difference is that in Iran, they have patriotism. In the Arab countries, they have nationalism.
That's a big difference.
It's a very big difference. You can't have patriotism where you don't have a clearly defined relationship with the country. In Iran, they are patriots. And the same is true in a somewhat different way in Turkey. We've been calling the country Turkey for 1,000 years. In Turkey, they only adopted the name after the First World War. This was a European name because it wasn't the local pattern. We think of, let's say, Denmark inhabited by Danish-speaking Danes, Turkey inhabited by Turkish-speaking Turks. It's obviously the same pattern. No, it isn't obviously the same pattern because they didn't see it that way. We have, for example, reports. I spent a lot of time reading diplomatic reports in both ways, including reports from Ottoman ambassadors who were sent to various places in Europe in the 17th, 18th centuries. And a recurring theme is they are angry and insulted when they are referred to as a Turkish ambassador. Because for them, at that time, Turk meant the peasants and nomads of Anatolia.
So they wanted to be Ottoman
ambassador,
right.
Or the ambassador of the Islamic Caliph.
Right.
Turkish was insulting. It's only in much more recent times that Turks have accepted to call themselves Turks. Previously, as I say, it was an ethnic term. It was not. It was a social term and a derogatory one. So in Iran, very much so. In Turkey, to a lesser but still very significant extent, you have patriotism as distinct from nationalism. And I think that that is a very, very important distinction. In the Arab world, the nearest approach to patriotism, I would say, is in Egypt. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. A while ago, it becomes like, 15 years ago. I mean, some years ago, I was given the chance to review your book. I think the big book on the Middle East, the last 2,000 years, for the New York Times Book Review. And something struck me about that work. There was a word you used about Turkey, which immediately just resonated to me. I didn't know much about Turkey, but it caught for me what I took to be the essence of this Turkish experiment and the Turkish people. You said the Turks were very earnest people. And this struck me as a very, very wise and quite, it distilled to me what I knew about, what I thought about Turkey. And you had sketched the sweep of Islamic history of these three populations, the Arabs who conceived the message of Islam, and then as in a relay race, they passed on to the Persians, who took a lot of, who gave us what Islamic philosophy and so on, which is really basically was Persian. And then the rise of the Turks, who picked up their role, and the role was that they would defend they would be soldiers and administrators, and they would defend this world of Islam and negotiate the terms of its engagement with Europe. And I thought that was a very, very apt way of summarizing these three different populations, the Arabs, the Persians, and the Turks, and the roles they played in Islamic history. What impresses me about the Turks is they accepted responsibility for their own history.
Yes.
And the Arabs haven't. I think that's a very big difference.
Well, they had originally, but then they lost it.
When? How would we say that?
Oh, I would say from the time of the Seljuks onwards.
Okay. So in a way, they stopped, they lost political power.
Yes.
I mean, they no longer ruled.
Right.
And particularly in their relation with the outside world, for several hundred years were negotiated by the Turks.
Right.
And this acquitted them of a certain kind of responsibility for their own history. I mean, that's a very different marker between the Arabs and the Turks.
Exactly.
And I think that has given Arab history this plaintive tone.
Yeah.
They've done this to us. Our history went wrong.
But you see, even in the Ottoman Empire, which was very much a Turkish empire,
Right.
If you read the Ottoman chronicles, describing at great length and in great detail the various wars that they fought against Austria, against Russia, they always invariably refer to their own side as the Muslims and to
Right.
the other side as the infidels.
Right.
They talk of a battle and give the casualties. So many Muslims, so many infidels. And then somebody writes a report of a visit to Vienna, and he says, we were received by 5 infidel officers who greeted us and escorted us and so on. The classification is still religious all the way along. You even find it in newspapers. At one time I was reading 19th century Turkish newspapers. It describes a traffic accident on the bridge. 2 infidels and a Muslim were killed.
Right.
It's the only classification that matters.
Yes. In terms of the sort of looking at these 3 populations, the Arabs, the Persians, and the Turks, again, in that kind of way, we shouldn't do national characters, but we do. You know, there is some power to these national portrait studies. What strikes me about the Persians, if the Turks are indeed very earnest, I think the Persians were extremely creative.
Yes.
You know, I think of one of these great scholars. England was blessed with many of them, as we know. E.G. Browne, who was, of course, the scholar on Persia.
Right.
He had this wonderful description. He said, Persia is a hotbed of philosophical system. It's a hotbed of philosophical system. That the Persians have argued philosophy. They argued metaphysics. They were deeper. There were more layers to Persian civilization and to
Right.
Persian identity than there were either in the case of the Arabs or the case of the Turks. Is that wrong, or?
No, I would agree with that up to a point. I mean, when the Arabs came out of Arabia in the 7th century and conquered all these countries of ancient civilization, the previous identities were totally lost.
Right.
I mean, Egypt, after all, was the home of a very ancient civilization going back millennia. The Egyptian language survived for a little while in the form of a Coptic dialect, then disappeared. The Babylonian past was obliterated. Only in Iran, they didn't preserve much, but they did preserve a separate sense of identity. They did preserve their language to some degree. They were not Arabized as the Iraqis and the Syrians and the Egyptians were. They still have a different language, full of Arabic loanwords, Islamized, written in the Arabic script, but still Persian. And in that sense, I think and of course, although they had forgotten their history, they had a very rich mythology to replace it.
Right. Right. Now, the Turks are without that historical depth. Is that fair enough?
I think so, yes.
I mean, do the Turks know that? Does it bother? I mean, is there a kind of, because my impression, correct me on this one, is that the Arabs and the Turks and the Iranians don't know each other very well.
I think that's true.
You know, by and large, their dialogue has been
Yes.
with the West.
Yes.
Each one. I mean,
Yes, you're right. They don't know each other very well.
You know, the Arabs, for example, they decided to do something very interesting with their 4 centuries in the bosom of the Ottoman world.
Yeah.
They decided it was a time of darkness, false, but that was the new nationalist historiography.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the literature from the period of the great Turco-Persian rivalry,
Right.
from the 16th century onwards for a while, Turkey and Iran were the 2 great powers of the Middle
Of
East,
course.
contesting supremacy. And they generally write about each other in very insulting terms.
Right.
I mean, the Iranians, speaking of the Turks, refer to them as Atrak, Napak, Bi-Idrak. Atrak is the Arabic plural.
Right.
Napak, impure.
Right.
Bi-Idrak, without understanding.
Right. So that's the image that they have of them.
Yes.
Yes.
The rhymed insult is very popular in that part of
Yes.
the world.
So these populations really don't quite know. I mean, the way they've spent a lot of time defining their identity and their grievances
Yes.
against the West.
Right.
But
But
there
that's
is no.
all modern, of course.
That's modern. That is modern.
Previously, the religious identity was the all-important one.
Yes.
And within the religious identity, it was dynastic.
Yes.
The state of which you were a subject.
Right.
The ruler to whom you owed allegiance.
Yes. But as we know, I mean, I think, again, I hate to do this to you again, but there is I remember a book you wrote in the mid to late 70s on history remembered, recovered, invented, which I thought was very nice categories that we remember history.
Yeah.
we recover it, we invent a lot of it. And I think that to a great extent, I see the writing of modern Arab history has been this kind of tremendous amount of invention has gone into it.
Yes.
To separate themselves from the Turks, to argue that this was an alien imposition, when it wasn't. You know, it had never been an alien imposition. And I think the role of the pioneers of of Arab nationalism, the Christian Arab intellectuals, they had a vested interest in setting up this kind of dichotomy between the Turks, between the Ottoman Empire and the Arab world.
No, it was first the non-Muslims and then the non-Sunnis.
Right.
Who had an interest in that.
Right. I mean, indeed, when you take a look at the way Arab intellectuals wrote Arab history, the primacy of the Christian Arab intellectuals was, I mean, this is very important to them.
Yes.
And there's a kind of irony that visits Arab history. The Christian Arabs take the lead in the writing of Arab nationalism, and a century later, Islamism begins to write them out of the community.
Well, the Arab Christians had an obvious interest in a form of identity and loyalty which includes them.
Right, right.
As against one which would exclude them.
How do we read like something like the Arab Awakening by George Antonius? You know, the manifesto of Arab nationalism.
Yes. He was a Greek Orthodox Christian.
He was a Greek Orthodox. Yes, he was a Lebanese Greek Orthodox.
Yes.
He grew up in Egypt. Right. And then he wrote this famous manifesto, The Arab Awakening, in 1938.
Right.
And I actually had to develop a certain curiosity about George Antonius. You can imagine if you write your first major book called The Arab Predicament, you will be interested in the man who wrote The Arab Awakening, several decades earlier.
Yes.
So I tracked him down, and there was something almost, I can't quite recall the depth of it, but I remember it was really quite an intense experience trying to find the trail of George Antonius. And I thought he was from Alexandria. It turned out he's from a little mountain town in Mount Lebanon named Deir al-Amr. And I began looking at George Antonius. He did his work courtesy of this a very, very wealthy Chicago industrialist who was interested in the Arab world, a man named Charles Crane of the famous King Crane Commission. So I tracked him down, and I found his papers in a clapboard house in New Hampshire, in Hanover, New Hampshire. And then eventually I wanted to see where he was buried. And I go to the Greek Orthodox cemetery in Jerusalem. And I find George Antonius buried there. He had died in 1942. And on his tombstone, there was these famous lines, "Arise and awaken, ye Arabs," from which he had drawn the title of the Arab Awakening. And he was a very tragic figure. The history he's told was completely false. It wasn't really history. It was, if you will, to use the categories used, it was invented history. He wanted to construct this Arab identity, and he willed it in this book.
Yeah. And he had quite a measure of success.
He had a lot of influence. He had a very gregarious wife who was the supreme hostess of Jerusalem at the time, Soraya Antonius. It's quite almost it's a tale, very melancholic in a way. He dies a very kind of forgotten and a man alone.
Yes.
But he had invented this idea of this, modern Arab consciousness, and it took off. It took off.
Obviously, members of minorities have a clear advantage in having a national and ethnic rather than a religiously defined identity.
Right. How does Iran, if you will, you already warned that people can have multiple identities, but how does it negotiate the terms of engagement between sort of the Persian pre-Islamic past and this new identity that this clerical class put on it?
Well, this is changing now in the present regime. I mean, previously the rediscovery of the ancient past was a source of great pride and a pillar of Iranian patriotism and
Right.
more generally self-awareness. But the present regime are against it. I mean, they strongly condemn, for example, the cult of Cyrus.
Right.
I mean, Cyrus was a great hero of the previous regime.
And he was, of course, a seminal figure to the Shah,
Yes.
Shah Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, because he wanted
Yes.
to.
Oh, I remember vividly the occasion when the Shah went to visit Cyrus's tomb in, what was it, 71 or 70?
Yeah, exactly.
Something like that, the beginning of the 70s, to celebrate the 1000th anniversary
Right.
of the foundation of the Persian Empire by Cyrus. And a number of people invited from all over the world, of whom I had the privilege to be one. And we were taken out there, and there we were placed in a, not exactly a building, a sort of construction which they had set there for us to sit. There was the tomb of Cyrus just opposite and on the ground. And then the Shah descended in a helicopter from the skies, stepped onto the helicopter, addressed a speech to Cyrus,
To Cyrus.
which was amplified.
Yes.
Very dramatic speech, of which all I can remember is the final phrase. He said, "O mighty Cyrus, you may sleep in peace, for we are awake."
Yes. And of course, 7-8 years later, he was as I think someone, it was Henry Kissinger who described him as a flying Dutchman looking for a port of call. No one would allow him, to
No,
land.
he was abominably treated.
Yes, and there's a very interesting chronicle of this poor man
Yes.
who had been America's principal ally in the region
Yes.
for many, many years, trying to find a place of exile, making the tour from Morocco to Egypt to the Bahamas to Mexico to Panama before eventually being granted asylum by Sadat. He was the only brave and principled man and honored this obligation.
Exactly.
I think you said something once that you said America is, perhaps I will not get it exactly right, but the sentiment, it's kinder to its enemies, that it's easier sometimes and safer to be an enemy of the United States than to be a friend.
I don't recall the exact words, but I
Yes.
do remember, yes.
Zia al-Haq, the Pakistani dictator ruler, not exactly the best of people. I think he launched Pakistan on this kind of Islamization journey. But he did have one moment of clarity where he said, being a friend of America is like sitting on the banks of a great river. It's lush and fertile, but every few years, the river changes course and you find yourself sitting in the middle of a barren desert.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, this
Or
is
in the middle of the torrent.
Yes, and this is not bad at all.
Yeah.
But on the identity of these, three populations, do you think the Iranians can make themselves, if you will, a factor in the life of the Arabs, given their own temperament, given their own identity? I mean, I ask this question because
Yes, I doubt it.
yes,
Even under the present regime, this is an Iranian state,
right,
and its primary loyalty is patriotism.
right. Its primary loyalty is to the idea of a Persian nation.
I think so.
Yes.
That's the impression I have.
What do you make of this very, very facile thing? Because, we can only think about these great civilizational questions in very facile ways, such as the predilection about the revival of the Shia. That somehow or another, all of a sudden, we're in the middle of a Shia revival.
Well, that's certainly happening in Iran.
Yes,
How far it'll go, I don't know.
yes.
I'm a historian, not a prophet. I deal with the past, not the future.
Not the future, exactly. But nevertheless, is that a revival of Shiaism, or is this just basically
I don't think it's a revival of Shiism. I think it's an exploitation of Shiism by the regime.
And in many ways, it's probably the argument could be made that the entire Khomeini dispensation, the entire Khomeini order, was a rebellion against Shiaism.
In a sense,
against the great Shia traditions
Right.
of quietism, the great Shia tradition of the clergy not being overly involved
Right.
in politics. And I think there is more of the way I look at the Shia world today, there is much greater authority for this very humble man, Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, sitting in his home in Najaf, than there is to Ali Khamenei in Iran with state power and money and goons and thugs working for him.
Yeah. They are discrediting their cause.
Exactly. I mean, when I don't know if I ever sort of gave you the details of visiting Ali Sistani. You come to a small lane in the bazaar in Najaf, just a few steps away from the shrine of Imam Ali in Najaf, and you come to the home of the great Ali Sistani. And there is just a simple house in just a nondescript lane. There's a piece of batik separating the house from the street, and you walk in, and there is the residence of Ayatollah Sistani. And the simplicity of the man and the modesty of the man and his insistence, if you will, on that the clergy should remain out of politics. You know, he has guided, if you will, in a subtle way, this transition in Iraq, and he has been a friend of the democratic experiment in Iraq. Had it not been for him, I think there is, the blood would have been to the knees in Iraq. And this, to me, represents that kind of high clerical tradition of Shi'ism.
It's also Sunni. You have this tradition that one does not get involved in government.
Yes.
You remember the story of Muhammad Abdul?
No.
Muhammad Abdul left Egypt at a certain point and went to Lebanon.
Right.
And you might say he was self-exiled from Egypt. And an Egyptian journalist went to interview him and asked him all sorts of questions about his beliefs and doctrines, which he answered. And then the journalist started asking him political questions, which he refused to answer.
Right.
And the journalist said, well, aren't you interested in politics? And his answer is famous. He said, أعوذ بالله من السياسة ومن فعل السياسة يسوس ومن حرف السين الداخل في السياسة.
Right. So he wanted nothing to do with politics because he thought it was a realm of compromise. On the other hand, you have someone like, today, possibly the most influential Sunni preacher in the Arab world, the Sheikh of Al Jazeera, which is Yusuf Qardawi, makes his home in Doha.
He's Egyptian.
He's Egyptian. He's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he is Egyptian. And he chose to make his home in Qatar and exercise enormous way in the Islamic world. Masters, he's equivalent, if you will, to the televangelist in the United States. I mean, he's very comfortable with television, very comfortable with the modern means of communication, and has enormous sway in the region as a whole.
And he knows how to use it very skillfully.
There is, again, to quote the late Egyptian diplomat Tahsin Bashir, he said about Qardawi, he said he combines a kind of zeal and cunning, and he's very good at it. I mean, he knows how to play that medium, and he knows how to do politics, and he understands what it takes for him to maintain his little presence in Doha. He stays away from the internal affairs of Qatar. He has nothing to say about that, but he has a lot to say about the wider Islamic agenda.
And he's certainly very intelligent.
What about the Islamic clergy in Saudi Arabia? I think they're basically pretty much, the way I read them, is they answer to the state. I mean, they are very...
That's my impression.
Right. I've observed them a little bit because I've been in and out of Arabia since, the early 1990s. And I think their partnership with the state is very intimate. And there is a wonderful vignette about the late King Khalid, who ruled between 75 and 82, where he was talking about the ulama, the religious class. And someone said, Your Majesty, this will not be acceptable to the ulama. That will not be acceptable to the ulama. And he said, well, the ulama are on my head. A sign of respect, as you know. They're on my head. But if I shake my head, they will fall to the ground. That the primacy of the state, the primacy of kingship is total.
Well, there are a lot of different Muslim traditions about that.
Right.
You know the story of the evening when the Caliph al-Ma'mun was sitting at his court with a group of courtiers. They were chatting about this and that and the other thing. And then they got onto the subject of happiness, definition of happiness. How do you define happiness? And they batted this back and forth, and then they turned to the Caliph and said, "O Commander of the Faithful, tell us, who is a happy man?" The Caliph said, "I don't know him and he doesn't know me."
That's the definition of a happy man.
Yes.
Who stays out of the political realm
Exactly.
altogether.
Uh,
Well, given the record of some Middle Eastern states in modern times, the despotisms,
exactly.
the Syrians, the Iraqis, the Libyans, etc.
Well, despotism is a modern development. I mean, in the past you have authoritarian government, but you don't have despotism.
I think this is one of your themes, actually.
Yeah.
In some of the, for all that's said about your, lack of sympathy, if you will, for nationalist movements and so on, you've made the argument and made it very, very well in many of your essays that, in fact, these kinds of despotisms are not indigenous to the traditions of the place.
Importation from
that they came via the Nazi world, the Marxist tradition, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.